Right, thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to my series, The Heart of London, in which I discuss the various historical and cultural places of interest in the heart of Greater London. And I've been doing this now for several months. And at the present moment, I'm back again at the Jewel Tower, which is one of the only remaining fragments of the original Palace of Westminster that was built by Edward the Confessor, although this particular building went up by Edward the Third. That was in 1365. I hope that you're finding this interesting, what I'm saying. I'm always appreciative of any comments you may wish to make underneath the videos, and to let me know if you're enjoying them and why, and if you're not, also I'd like to know that, because what I try to do is make these as interesting and as engaging as they possibly can be. So what I will now do is move on from here. What I want to do at this moment is talk a bit about the old Palace of Westminster, which was, I say, built by Edward the Confessor. Was changed and chopped around rather a lot over the centuries, and then used by Parliament when Henry VIII moved out in 1529. So let me go back and have a look again at the diagram, which we saw a little bit earlier in my previous videos, and this is going to require me to have to get down on my knees, which is something I don't find very easy, but nevertheless, all for the sake of art, ladies and gentlemen, we'll make a very good effort at it. So okay, Jewel Tower, here we have the diagram which you've already seen, and I have to do this in such a way that I don't cast a shadow on it, so that you can clearly see what I'm talking about. Only my apparatus casts a shadow, which is a bit of a shame. I don't think I can avoid that. What I wanted to do before I moved on is to talk about Westminster Hall, which you can see here, and my finger is pointing. And also I wanted to point out St. Stephen's Chapel, which again was built by Edward the Third in 1297. And I shall call your attention to that, because it forms a very important part of the story of the Palace of Westminster. So anyway, the point is, it's just coming off at a right angle to Westminster Hall. So this, as I say, is the Palace of Westminster, where the kings and queens of England used to live from the time really of William II all the way through to Henry VIII, and he then moved out into the Palace of Whitehall, which had then been built by Cardinal Wolsey. And once he was disgraced, the king decided to move in, leaving the Palace of Westminster to the House of Lords and to the House of Commons for the use of Parliament. Now, what I propose to do is to stand up straight, and that is always an effort, but let's just see how I get on. It's going to have an effect, I think. There we are. Yes, it is. Never mind. Sorry about that. But we've done it. We've done it. Okay. So, I was talking about the chapel, and as time went on, the next man, the king who succeeded Edward the Third was Richard II. Not a very spectacularly good king. He was eventually deposed in the year 1399 for his long reign of misrule, and he was formally deposed in Westminster Hall, which you will see in a moment, or at least you'll see the outside of Westminster Hall. It's more or less directly in front of us, with that building with that large window. After Richard II, that's when we started to have problems, because by the laws of primogeniture, which means that you choose the eldest son to succeed, the eldest the next eldest son would have been Lionel, the Duke of Clarence. Now he was a bit doolally, to be quite honest. And so that's when Henry Bolingbroke, his cousin, who was just one generation down, the Duke of Lancaster, seized his opportunity to become the King of England. So you had, and he became Henry IV. So you had Henry IV, and his son was Henry V. Henry V, who won the Battle of Agincourt. And his son was Henry VI. Henry VI, sad to say, went doolally towards the end of his reign, and that's when we had the Duke of York, who was actually descended from Lionel, claim his right to the throne by primogeniture. And there was a battle then between the families, the cousins, as to who had the better claim. So this was really what the story of the Wars of the Roses were about. Anyway, they succeeded in dethroning Henry VI, and the next king to come along was Edward IV. Edward IV also had a son, Edward V. It was Edward V who was imprisoned in the Tower by his wicked uncle, Richard III. And it was Richard III who was defeated at the Battle of Bosworth by Henry Tudor, who later became Henry VII. And as I turn the video around, you can see the Henry VII Chapel. This is built to house the last mortal remains of Henry Tudor, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Now then, it was his son who became Henry VIII, and Henry VIII married Queen Catherine of Aragon, and it was okay. The only problem was that she wasn't producing a male heir, and Henry VIII got worried about that because they didn't want to go back to the old Wars of the Roses as they had them. So he appealed to the Pope for a divorce and sent Wolsey off to Rome in order to secure one. Wolsey wasn't able to get the divorce, and so that's how Wolsey was eventually lost his job, and that's how Henry VIII moved into Whitehall Palace. So in 1529, the king moved out of the Palace of Westminster into the Palace of Whitehall, and the House of Commons, which had been conducting its debates in the chapter house, which you can't see, it's behind this tree, then moved into St. Stephen's Chapel, which again you can't see, but nevertheless it burnt down in 1834. The important thing to note about the St. Stephen's Chapel is that by that time we had all these religious revivals and upheavals, so they used it for secular building. The Speaker of the House of Commons sat in the site where the high altar was, but on either side you had choir stalls, so this was important. This is where the members of Parliament used to sit while they were conducting their debates, and you still have the same arrangement in the modern House of Commons. Of course, it's on a slightly different location now. But the House of Commons was important, and the House of Parliament was important, because in 1535 they produced the Act of Supremacy, which effectively made Henry VIII the head of the Church of England rather than the Pope. So that's when we had our own national church. And then after that, you had a number of people. You had some people who thought that was terrible. They wanted to go back to the old arrangement when the Church of England was governed by the Pope. They were referred to as the Papists. And then, of course, you had other people who said the reforms had not gone far enough, and they were known as the Puritans. But anyway, Queen Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and who was also buried in the Henry VII Chapel with her half-sister Mary, she was very skillful in handling Parliament. She refused to give her assent to one or two bills, but on the whole she was diplomatic and she was intelligent, and she managed to avoid coming into confrontation with them. James I, who succeeded her in 1603, was not nearly so skillful. Now, James I, he was also James I of England. He was James VI of Scotland, because at that time England and Scotland were two separate countries, although they had two separate parliaments, but they had one king. And even very early in his reign, there were attempts to dethrone James I and VI. And the first of these was called the Main Plot, which took place a year after he came to the throne. That was in 1604, and that was the plot in which Sir Walter Raleigh, who was sort of hanging over from the Elizabethan period, he got involved in that somehow, either rightly or wrongly, and he would have been executed immediately, but they spared his life and they sent him off to live in the Tower of London, where he was imprisoned. And he occupied his time writing a history of the world. The year after that, 1605, we had the Gunpowder Plot. We had a number of people who were loyal to the old Roman Catholic Church, and what they wanted to do was to blow up the House of Parliament by storing gunpowder in the cellars underneath the House of Lords, on the occasion when James I came in to open up the new session of Parliament. And that plot was foiled at the very last minute, and Guy Fawkes was arrested. He was taken off to the Tower of London and tortured, and then he was brought back here into Old Palace Yard for his execution. He was going to be hanged, drawn and quartered. That meant to say that he was hanged by the neck, not until he was entirely dead, but almost dead. Then he was sort of cut down. They cut out his intestines and all his entrails, and then they cut the body into four pieces. They cut his head off, and quite what happened to that piece of those body we don't really know. We don't know where he's buried. But in 1618, James I apparently took pity on Sir Walter Raleigh, who was then languishing in the Tower of London, and sent him off on a fool's errand to go to a place called Guyana. But he was given strict instructions. He was not to engage the Spaniards in warfare. Otherwise they would revive the sentence, which of course is what happened, and that's what happened. I mean, it's just that Sir Walter Raleigh was brought back to England and he was put on trial again, and the sentence of execution, he was beheaded rather than hanged, drawn and quartered, and his body is buried, or was buried, still there, in the Church of St Margaret in Westminster. So that was James I, and his son came to the throne after that, and his son was Charles I. Now, the Stuarts, although they were loyal to the Church of England and maintained the new arrangement, still had a sort of secret loyalty, I think it was, to the Roman Catholic Church. And Charles I married a lady called Henrietta, who was a daughter of the King of France. And this was much to the annoyance of the Puritans. So there was considerable discontent against the rule of Charles. Also, he was taxing people far too much, and Parliament would refuse to give him the taxes that he wanted. So he had to go round this another way. He started reviving some very old laws by which he could circumvent Parliament, and he found one of these was called ship money. He was entitled to ship money, but originally the laws applying to ship money only really related to ports on the coast, but he started applying it to all the other towns and cities around the country, and so there was considerable unrest. A man called John Hampden, who was the Member of Parliament, led a group to oppose the King. And John Hampden and 4 other members of Parliament were actually sitting in the House of Commons when King Charles burst into the House of Commons and demanded their arrest. Actually, all those Hampden and his 4 friends had managed to escape. But that was really the incident which provoked the Civil War that was then fought between the parliamentarians who were fighting for Parliament and the royalists who were fighting for the king. And the issue at hand was who had the ultimate authority in governing the country. So the king raised his standard at Newark, and there was a big battle that was fought at a place called Edgehill, which is in Warwickshire in 1642, and there was a series of other battles. I won't go through them all. The most important of them was the Battle of Naseby in Northamptonshire. But there we are, we've got the head of Charles I there. Now, King Charles set up his own capital in Oxford. The parliamentarians held London, and they also held all the other major ports in the country, which really prevented King Charles from getting supplies from France and Spain as he wished to do. And after the Battle of Naseby, 1645, we had, of course, Oliver Cromwell, who had by that time organised the new model army, and really fought this civil war. It's actually referred to as the First Civil War. That came to a conclusion, and Charles made a number of undertakings to Parliament which he didn't keep, and so that started the Second Civil War afterwards in 1648. A man called Colonel Pride managed to get rid of 200 members of Parliament who were supportive of the king. This was called Pride's Purge. When that happened in late 1648, and in early 1649, in January, they had captured King Charles I. They put him on trial in Westminster Hall, this large building across the road, and then they sentenced it on the charge was treason. Charles refused to plead. He said you couldn't possibly accuse, it just wasn't legally possible to accuse a king of committing treason. But they did anyway, and they found him guilty, and they sentenced him to be beheaded outside the banqueting house. So again, that is the head of King Charles above this doorway in the church. And over the road, you can see the man who took control of the country afterwards. We had a period known as the Commonwealth. That was just an old-fashioned English word for republic, who promptly abolished the monarchy, and they also abolished the House of Lords. And the government was ruled by a number of members of Parliament who had managed to escape Pride's Purge, and they were referred to as the Rump. And they got on for a while, but in the end Oliver Cromwell lost his patience with them and dismissed them. That was in 1653. They then created a document which they called the Instrument, which was actually a written constitution, and tried to govern through that. And that was in 1655, and Oliver Cromwell attempted to rule the country through 12 major generals. He cut the country into 12 parts and had a major general assigned to each one of them. But again, people were still discontent. The taxes went up, of course. And in 1658, Oliver Cromwell died. There was some talk about bringing his son in as his successor. That would have been Richard, but Richard was pretty useless as a king, would have been, or even a protector, Lord Protector. So they thought again. Really, the decisive event was a man called General Monk, who was then, by that time, leader of the army. He changed his allegiance from the Commonwealth to King Charles II, and then he marched his men all the way down from Scotland to London, and they threw down their arms as soldiers of the Commonwealth, and then were ordered to pick them up as soldiers of the King. So that's when we had the restoration of King Charles II. That happened in 1660, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. But I'll say bye-bye for now, and I will see you in the next video.